Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to class tonight. We are going to continue on working with a buyer. Tonight, we're going to focus on the agency disclosure and election slash buyer form, the buyer broker agreements, the date me or marry me. There's two different forms. And then we're going to talk about the seller compensation addendum. And the reason why I wanted to cover those three tonight is because they all kind of go hand in hand. And tonight I may not be reading every addendum completely because there's just I wanted tonight's class to kind of flow a little differently. We will go back through and we will read each form individually, but I wanted to talk to you all about the process of how to get a buyer because of the changes that took effect on August 17th nationwide. We now have to do things a little bit differently when we're working with a buyer, and that is getting a employment agreement in place between you and the buyer. And before you even get an employment in place, you have to establish an agency. Are you representing them as the buyer or are you representing them as the seller? Tonight, of course, we're going to be referring to it on a buyer side. So first things first, this form can be found in Transaction Desk. If you have your buyer template already set up, it'll automatically auto-populate into the transaction once you add a new transaction into Transaction Desk, and if, I should say, if you choose the buyer template that you have saved. If you do not have the buyer template set up, I do have a recorded class on my page on YouTube where you can go back and you can actually set that up. However, moving forward for tonight, so this is the first form that you should have signed no matter what, because you have to be able to establish the agency before you actually enter into an employment agreement. So the agency form should always be signed prior to the employment agreement, and this is what the agency covers. It discloses what exactly you're doing. So for the buyer, a broker other than the seller's broker can agree with the buyer to act as the broker for the buyer. In these situations, the buyer's broker is not representing the seller, even if the buyer's broker is receiving compensation for services rendered either in full or in part from the seller or through the seller's broker. A buyer's broker has fiduciary duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, confidentiality, and accounting in dealings with the buyer. Other potential buyers represented by buyer may consider, make offers, or acquire an interest in the same or similar properties as the buyer is seeking. So this is the first step. You got to make sure that they understand that you are going to be the buyer's broker. The broker representing both the seller and the buyer through limited representation broker. It states that the broker, either acting directly or through one or more licenses within the same brokerage firm, can legally represent both the seller and the buyer in a transaction, but only with the knowledge and informed consent of both the seller and the buyer. In these situations, the broker acting through its licensees represents both the buyer and the seller with limitations on the duties owed to the buyer and the seller. And the counterpart says the broker will not, without written authorization, disclose to other parties that the seller will accept a price or terms other than the stated in the listing, and that the buyer will accept a price or terms other than offered. And B, there will be conflicts in the duties of loyalty, obedience, disclosure, and confidentiality. Disclosure of confidential information may be made only with written authorization. So in a nutshell, you can represent both buyer and seller, but you have to have written acceptance or acknowledgement from both parties. And there's a specific form that we'll cover later that covers all that. The addendum goes on to say that regardless of who the broker represents in the transaction, the broker shall exercise reasonable care and for the performance of the broker's duty, and shall be truthful and honest to both the buyer and the seller, and shall disclose all known facts which materially and adversely affect the consideration to be paid by any party. And then pursuant to the ARS 32-2156, sellers, lessors, and brokers are not obligated to disclose that a property is or has been the site of a natural death, suicide, homicide, or any crime classified as a felony. They do not have to disclose that it's owned or occupied by a person exposed to HIV or diagnosed of having AIDS or any other disease not known to be transmitted through common occupancy of real estate. And 3, located in the vicinity of a sex offender. Sellers or sellers' representatives may not treat the existence, terms, or conditions of offers as confidential unless there is a confidentiality agreement between the parties. The duties of the broker in a real estate transaction do not relieve the seller or the buyer from their responsibility to protect their own interests. The seller and the buyer should carefully read all agreements to ensure that the documents adequately express their understanding of the transaction. So that is just the disclosure of it. We, of course, are talking about the buyer broker. This is new as of August. The agency election does not establish broker compensation, which is why not only do you need this signed, you also need the buyer broker. If you only get this form signed, this is not saying that you're going to be paid anything. This is just establishing your agency. So it goes on to say compensation paid by a buyer or seller to their broker is not set by law, is always fully negotiable, and the amount chosen shall be documented in a separate written employment agreement after discussion with their broker. Should a seller also choose to offer compensation to a buyer's broker, the offered amount is also not set by law, is fully negotiable, and agreed upon after discussion with the seller's broker. This section right here, the top section, this is if you represent a buyer. The bottom section is if you represent a seller. Of course, we're referring to buyers for this class, so you are going to check line 48 and line 50. What does this mean? This means that you're representing the buyer as a buyer's broker, and it also means that you can show the buyer properties listed with broker's firm, and buyer agrees that broker shall act as agent for both buyer and seller, provided that the sellers consent to limited representation. In the event of a purchase, buyer and seller's informed consent shall be acknowledged in a separate writing other than the purchase contract. So go ahead and when you are representing the buyer, you check line 48, line 50, and then you come down here to line 60 and check buyer. This is just acknowledging copy of the receipt of this disclosure. Your client signs this. So again, in recap, this is establishing your agency. This is the first and foremost form that you have your buyer sign. Even before you talk about anything else, this is the first form that they should sign. Most of the time, you're sending it out together. That's fine. Always send this one first so that it is always signed first. Okay. Any questions about the agency form? Okay, we're going to move on now to the date me or marry me forms. And I'm going to explain the difference between the two. So the date me form, that is the buyer broker agreement to show a property. So this is one way you can establish an employment agreement with a buyer. Pretty much what this is stating in a nutshell is that the buyer is only dating you. They can go out and they can cheat on you. They can work with any agent that they choose to. So they can work with you. They can work with Tom, John, Ashley, whoever it might be. And whoever writes the contract is the one that's going to get compensated. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want my clients to go out and cheat on me. I want to know that they are committed, just like they want to know that I am committed to them. However, some buyers are very reluctant to enter into a exclusive relationship with you, and that's completely understandable. When I work with the buyer, I explain to them that there's this and I do explain it to them, a dating form, and I go over what I just said, or there's a marriage form, and I go over what that one is, which I'll go through after we discuss this form. But this form, it does not lock them into an exclusive agreement with you. It still has to have a clear start date and an end date. I usually will put a year, especially if I have an exclusive agreement. But let's say that your client is like, I just want to go out this weekend and take a look, and if I find something, we can write an offer. They may not want the commitment, and it's okay. You could just have them sign this, but keep in mind they can go and cheat on you and get another agent. It clearly states that the buyer instructs the broker to locate what kind of property, whether it's residential, land, commercial. If you're not an expert in commercial, I don't recommend doing it. Not that you can't learn it, but it is a completely different beast than residential. It's best to just refer it out. And we do have a couple commercial agents that work for ProSmart. Let's see. Oh, let me back up because this is important. Notice to the buyer are all realtors, in caps, every single person that identifies as a realtor are required to have a signed written agreement prior to showing a home to a buyer. Buyer engages broker for the purpose of viewing property and providing real estate services at buyer's discretion that may include contract negotiation and advocacy services throughout a real estate transaction. The agency relationship for the buyer and the broker determines how the broker will work for a broker, rephrase. The agency relationship between broker and buyer determines how broker will work on buyer's behalf and will be documented in the real estate agency disclosure and election form. Remember, we already established our agency, so we're good. The broker compensation is not set by law, nor by any board, association, realtors, multiple listing services, or in any manner other than as fully negotiated between the broker and the buyer in this agreement. So even though it's only a dating form, you still have to state or write out and agree to a compensation. So you put whatever 3% or a dollar amount or other, whatever it might be, but it has to be clear. Broker compensation shall be due and paid at the time of and as a condition of close of escrow. So the only way you're going to get paid is if you write the contract. Buyer acknowledge and you actually close it. Buyer authorizes broker to accept compensation from seller or seller's broker, which shall be credited against the buyer broker compensation. Broker will not receive any amount greater than the broker compensation from any source for services provided in this agreement. So in a nutshell, let me break this down. Your buyer broker agreement currently states that if you close on a property and it is negotiated at 3%, the seller agrees to it, or if the buyer agrees to it, depending on if the seller is willing to pay it, you're going to get paid 3%. If the seller is offering 4%, but your buyer broker is only for 3%, you only get 3%. The extra percent goes to the buyer. You also need to make sure, depending on their loan type, if they can even accept that extra 1%. That might be a different conversation. You might need to adjust your commission agreement or compensation agreement here with the buyer to increase it to the 4%, which you can do. You can amend it. But unless it's amended, you can't receive more than what this addendum says. If this addendum says 3%, the seller is only willing to pay you 2%, the buyer is on the hook for the additional 1% because this is what the buyer agreed to. You have two options. Well, you actually have a couple options. When you go to negotiate the purchase contract, you can negotiate with the seller to maybe offer 1% seller concession to offset that 1%. Again, your client has to be well aware that you're doing this. Or you can say, okay, seller, I'll accept the 2% that they're willing to pay me. And I in turn am going to do a commission authorization adjustment prior to closing. And I will reduce this agreed amount to 2% so that my client, the buyer, doesn't have to come out of pocket. So there's a couple different ways you can get creative with this, but just know that if the seller is offering more than what this addendum says, you do not get it. It goes to the buyer. And if the buyer can't get it because of whatever loan type, maybe their concessions are maxed out, you can get creative and maybe just have that conversation with your client and amend this and increase it to 4%. Okay, so the buyer showing instructions, the broker shall show properties listed that fit the buyer's criteria regardless of compensation offered to the broker by seller or seller's broker unless instructed otherwise by the buyer in writing. If necessary, a buyer instructs broker to negotiate broker compensation to be paid by seller or seller's broker. These negotiations shall not jeopardize, delay, or interfere with the initiation, processing, or finalizing of a transaction. So, if you have it in writing from your buyer that your buyer does not want to see any listings if the seller is not willing to compensate the buyer's agent, you do not have to show those houses. Just make sure you get it in writing. So what I do is before I show any homes, if I have written instruction from my client, I will contact the seller's agent by text or giving them a phone call. Never do anything commission related or compensation related through aligned showings. You can get fined or lose your license for doing that. Do it through a private text or call them. You can ask them if the seller is willing to pay a buyer broker compensation. We'll leave it at that. It doesn't matter the amount. So, I guess it would matter the amount if you are not willing to adjust your commission on the backside before closing if the seller is paying less than what your buyer broker agreement is for. But that's again, that's a conversation that you have to have up front with your buyer because they have to be aware of everything. But you don't have to necessarily get that final number from the seller before showing the home because everything's negotiated through the contract anyways. So it really doesn't matter what they're willing to offer in the beginning. You can always be creative when doing the contract to the seller and the seller's agent to get your compensation covered. Or you always have the option to reduce it if the seller is only willing to pay X amount. Hopefully all that makes sense. Of course, with all contracts, equal housing opportunity, the broker's policy is to abide by all local, state, and federal laws prohibiting discrimination against any individual or group of individuals. For more information, see Fair Housing Advisory. And if the buyer agrees, they sign this form. You also sign this form because, again, this is an employment agreement. So this is a dating form. I do not use this form unless I absolutely have to. So let's talk about the Marry Me form. The Marry Me form is an exclusive employment agreement between you and the buyer. This is a form that is going to guarantee, well, it should guarantee, I should say, that your buyer is not going to go out and cheat on you and find another agent because they are locked into this agreement. So if they end up going out and working with another agent while you're under an employment agreement, as long as this is still valid, then they run the risk of paying multiple compensations to buyer agents. So you want to definitely let them know that they are committed to you, you are committed to them, you are in a marriage, quote unquote. And it definitely comes with a lot of trust. And again, they can't go out and cheat on you and then, you get paid no matter what. So if they end up cheating on you and someone else writes a contract, you get paid. This is the form that is going to protect your compensation the most. A lot of the information is the same from the other form, but this is an exclusive agreement. It is stating that it is between the buyer and the broker in consideration of the buyer's agreement to assist buyer to locate, negotiate, and facilitate the purchase of a property. Buyer gives broker the exclusive and irrevocable right to represent the buyer in the purchase of a property during this term. Buyer acknowledges that signing more than one buyer-broker exclusive employment agreement or similar agreements could make the buyer liable to compensate multiple brokers. So you definitely want to make them aware. This is exclusive. We are married. Has a clear start and end date. And of course, you need to note what kind of property. We're negotiating on the buyer's direction to obtain acceptable terms and conditions for the purchase, exchange, and option of the property. We're there to assist the buyer during the transaction within the scope of the broker's expertise in licensing. We have already established our agency through the agency disclosure and election form. This was not on the properties form, the dating form as I like to call it, but it is on the exclusive. And you should definitely have this conversation with any buyer, regardless of any kind of agreement that you have, whether it's the dating or the marry me form. The buyer agrees to work exclusively with the broker and be accompanied by broker on buyer's first visit to any property. Does not include an open house. If broker does not accompany a buyer on the first visit to any property, including a model home, new home, lot, or open house, it says open house, but they technically do not have to have you with them at an open house. Held by a builder, seller, or other real estate broker, buyer acknowledges that the builder, seller, or seller's broker may refuse to compensate the broker, which will eliminate any credit against the agreed upon broker compensation below. So if your client goes to a new build without you, first things first, say, please do not do that again. And then get on the phone and call the agent right away in the office. Say, I am so sorry. I have warned my client not to go without me. Is there anything that I can do to get them registered? The sooner you do that, the better. And this is why I always say, create strong relationships with sales office members at a builder, because I had a buyer go in, and I won't say the builder, many months ago and multiple times. And then they hired me. We want you to help us through the new build process. We don't know what we're doing. Great, let's go to some new builds. Oh, we've already been to many. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, which ones? They told me. I got on the phone right away. I called them. I said, listen, we've worked in the past together. Is there any way you would allow me to register them? Some builders said no. Some builders said yes. So having that relationship is key. But again, not all builders are going to allow you to represent them because you didn't register them. You weren't with them the first time. So you definitely need to drill this in the buyer's brain in your first meeting. The first time you ever speak with them when you're doing the agency form, or you can always go over it with this, talk to them about the importance of making sure that you are with them. Let's see. Buyer agrees to review the Arizona Department of Real Estate Buyer Advisory to assist the buyer's inspections and investigations. We're not talking about that form tonight, but I do want to mention it because it's on this form. This is a PDF that you can either print and give to them in person the first time you meet them. You can get their email address. You can email it to them as a PDF. But you should definitely be giving them this form, which can be found in Transaction Desk. Again, if you have your buyer template set up, it'll automatically auto-populate it when you create a file, or you can save it to your desktop just so you have a blank copy of it and you can easily email it out to your new buyer, your buyers that you work with. But absolutely very important to give it to them in the beginning. And maybe after you get under contract, maybe during the inspection form. I email it to my clients multiple times. And the reason why is because you're giving them a really big document that is full of so many helpful links and websites that they can go to and they can do the research. If it is important to them, they can find some kind of resource to look into it further, investigate it, whatever it might be. So um, you're just being really helpful by giving them this buyer advisory up front and then again throughout the transaction, just reminding them this should be your best friend through the transaction. I am here to guide you, but it is up to you to do your due diligence. And here's a great pamphlet that is full of information. So just give it to them, be the source of the source, if that makes sense. I think that's the right saying. Anyways, just give it to them in the beginning. Okay. And so I love that they added this on this document because that is such a huge, important pamphlet to give them. It also takes a lot of liability off of you. Can someone still sue you? Absolutely. But if you say, well, I gave you the buyer advisory form and it clearly had a section on lead-based paint or whatever, there's even more documents that you have to give them, but I gave you the tool and I said, if it's important to you, here's a website to look at, da, 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 da. I think you get my point. Very important. Again, this form states again that buyer compensation is not set by law, nor by any board, association of realtors, multiple listing service, or any manner other than as fully negotiated between the broker and the buyer in this agreement. Buyer initials here. Okay, now we get into the important stuff. What you're getting paid. Very similar to the dating form, but this one's a little bit more detailed because it has a retainer fee because you're exclusive now. You want to check with your broker and make sure that they allow non-refundable retainer fees because remember, this is not our money. Whatever we do in real estate is our broker's money. So if you collect a broker non-refundable retainer fee, that doesn't go to you, that goes to the broker. So you need to be aware of, well, whose money is it? First of all, everything's our broker's. And then talk to the broker about, okay, well, how are you going to get paid from that? Do you get a portion of it? So definitely have that conversation with your broker. And is that going to be credited against your buyer broker compensation below? Yes or no? Again, talk to your broker. So 3% or whatever compensation you want. I say try for 3%. Why not? We're worth it. You work hard enough for it. And again, if the seller's only willing to pay 2 and you're willing to reduce your compensation, great. No harm, no foul. That is a conversation, though, you have to have up front with your buyer. It is putting a lot of trust that you will do a compensation adjustment before closing so that the buyer, if it wasn't negotiated for the full 3% with the seller, that the buyer does not come out of pocket for the difference. So that is a definite conversation you have to have in the beginning. And again, you're married, so there is a lot of trust that goes between you and the buyer. Talks about the compensation. It can only be in U.S. currency and paid at the time of and as a condition of closing for purchase and exchange or as otherwise agreed upon in writing. It talks about the compensation being from the seller or the seller's broker. A seller or seller's broker may offer compensation to broker. Buyer authorizes broker to accept compensation from seller or seller's broker, which shall be credited against the broker compensation. If the seller or seller's broker offer compensation is greater than the broker compensation, the broker shall be paid the broker compensation and the balance shall be credited to the buyer to the extent allowed by the buyer's lender. Remember, I already talked about that. Broker will not receive any amount greater than the broker compensation from any source for services provided in this agreement. So this even goes for a new build. So again, it's just having that conversation. The seller's willing to offer more than what we agreed to. Would you like the 1% or do you feel that I'm worth it and I should be compensated? Oh, great. Yeah, I'm worth 4%. Great. Let's go ahead and do an adjustment to the addendum and then I will receive that 4%. But if you don't agree on it, anything over what you've agreed upon goes to the buyer as long as the buyer's lender agrees to it and it's okay. If the seller or seller's broker offer compensation is less than the broker compensation, buyer may request seller to pay the broker compensation as part of the offer to purchase the property, maybe a seller concession, something like that. Any broker compensation not paid by seller or seller's broker shall be paid by the buyer. Notice, unless modified by VA regulations, VA finance transactions shall be conditioned upon the broker compensation being paid by the seller or seller's broker. I do need to follow up on this because I want to say that they were looking into having this changed, that the vet could pay the buyer's broker compensation. But as far as I know, this is still, because it's in this addendum, and this addendum has not been updated as far as my knowledge, this is still the case that it has to be paid by the seller. Okay. Failure to complete. Once an acceptable property is located, the buyer agrees to act in good faith to acquire the property and conduct any inspections, investigations of the property that broker deems material and or important. If completion of any transaction is prevented by buyer's breach or with the consent of buyer other than as provided in the purchase contract, the broker compensation shall be due and payable to the buyer. Compensation after the expiration date. Unless you've got a date in here, once this contract or agreement, I should say, expires, you're done. So either you extend it or you're done. But if you put a date in here, say like 30 days, that means that after it is expired, the buyer agrees to pay the compensation. If the buyer enters into an agreement to purchase, exchange, or option any property shown or negotiated by broker on behalf of the buyer during the term of this agreement. If the buyer closes escrow on the property pursuant to the purchase contract that has executed during the term of this agreement, or the buyer closes escrow on a property for which escrow was open during the term of this agreement. So as long as you are under contract, you will still get paid. I would not risk it. I would just do an addendum to extend it so that this contract is after close of escrow. I just wouldn't want to risk it, even though it states that as long as you're under contract, you're fine. I just wouldn't risk it. So just do an addendum. Super easy. It talks about the broker can show properties listings that fit the buyer's criteria, regardless of the compensation offered by broker, by seller or seller's broker, unless instructed otherwise by the buyer in writing. Again, that just means that if the buyer says, I don't want to see any houses, if they're not willing to pay your commission, you can do that. Just make sure you have it in writing. And you can't let any kind of compensation jeopardize the contract, delay, interfere with the initiation, process, or finalizing of the transaction. And it states here, if the buyer does not wish to view properties unless the seller or seller's broker has offered adequate compensation, the buyer must make that instruction in writing. Still have to follow all the equal fair housing. Let's talk about other potential buyers. The buyer consents and acknowledges that other potential buyers represented by the broker may consider, make offers, or acquire an interest in the same or similar properties as the buyer is seeking. So if you've got multiple buyers, you can show them all the same listing, especially if they're looking in the same area, same price point, that kind of stuff. And they are releasing the broker. The buyer recognizes, acknowledges, and agrees that the broker is not qualified nor licensed to offer advice on financial, legal, tax matters regarding real estate transactions. Brokers, if requested, may provide buyer the name of third-party professionals who claim to perform related services, such as a home inspector. Buyer is instructed to independently investigate all potential third-party professionals and use their sole discretion in selecting which third-party professional to hire, if any. Buyer expressly releases, holds harmless, and indemnifies broker from any and all liability and responsibility regarding buyer selection and use of third-party professionals to perform related services or buyer election not to use the services of such third-party professionals. If there's any kind of dispute, it talks about that and how they agree to mediate any dispute or claim arising out or relating of this agreement. All mediation costs shall be paid equally by the parties. Let's see. In the event the mediation does not resolve all disputes or claims, the unresolved disputes or claims shall be submitted for binding arbitration. So all parties have to agree to that. Hopefully you never have to do this, but just know that that's kind of the process. Attorney fees, any non-related realtor association proceedings are to enforce a compensation due to broker pursuant to this agreement. The prevailing party shall be awarded their reasonable attorney fees and arbitration costs. We follow Arizona law. Copies and counterparts are allowed for this document. I think the only document that cannot be done in counterpart is lead-based paint. The entire agreement and any addenda and attachment shall constitute an entire agreement between the buyer and the broker and shall supersede any other written or oral agreements between buyer and broker and can be modified only by a writing signed by buyer and broker. The capacity, the buyer warrants that the buyer has legal capacity, full power, and authority to enter into this agreement and consummate this transaction contemplated there hereby on buyer's behalf or on behalf of the buyer of the party buyer represents as appropriate. And then if they accept, they go ahead and sign down below. And again, this is an agreement, so you also sign. So entering into an exclusive agreement definitely entails a lot more. That's why it's a longer addendum. But again, you know, it's an employment agreement and it's exclusive, so it should be more detailed. Definitely has to outline a couple more facts and features and whatnot. So that's the difference between the two forms, and feel free to steal the way that I describe it, the dating form and the marry me form. Any questions on the two different types of employment when working with a buyer? Okay, let's move on. The last form that we're going to talk about tonight is actually the seller compensation addendum. And the reason why I kind of wanted to tie it into tonight's class is because we talked a lot about getting the seller to pay for the buyer's compensation. So you have to understand the process, because while you, hold on, I got a question. Oh, I do love the marry me, date me, spin too. It definitely resonates with people and they really grasp the difference. And it's easier for them to understand, so feel free to steal it. Okay, so like I was saying, this kind of goes hand in hand, because while you have a buyer-broker agreement in place with the buyer, if the buyer, like, yeah, they've agreed to it, but they really don't have the money to pay you, you have to be able to, or maybe they do, but maybe they don't want to. You really have to be able to negotiate with the sellers and the seller's agent for the seller to pay. And in order to do that, this addendum has to be submitted with every single offer you write. Hands down. This is the number one form that is going to pay you if the seller agrees to it. So, who's initiating it? The buyer, because we're asking the seller to pay the buyer's agent compensation. The following additional terms and conditions are hereby included as part of the contract or lease agreement between the seller and buyer for the above referenced premises. The seller shall pay broker representing buyer compensation, which may be credited to the buyer in whole or in part as follows. And so you would put what you want to get paid. So, you know, maybe you had a conversation with the seller's agent ahead of time and you said, is the seller offering to pay buyer agent compensation? And they respond with, yes, in fact, we're offering 3%. you respond, great, thank you so much. And again, you're not talking about any kind of compensation in aligned showings. You are doing this outside in a personal text or phone call. So they're willing to pay you 3%. So you put 3% on here. The amount paid pursuant to line 10 herein is in addition, keyword, in addition to any seller concessions credited to buyer in the contract if applicable. So the seller's paying me 3%. That does not mean that they're giving me 3% seller concession. Seller concession is completely different. Do not confuse the two. It has happened. Check if applicable. Pursuant to a separate written agreement, compensation agreement between brokers, seller broker has agreed to compensate the buyer broker in the amount of X amount of the full purchase price, which is independent of and in addition to the compensation in this agreement. This is just if you've got some other kind of written compensation between the brokers. I don't think you really should ever have any additional compensation because let's see, what could that possibly be? I want to say that it would be maybe a bonus or something like, hey, bring me a buyer and close this transaction by the end of the year. And if you do, I'm going to give you an extra 1%. But again, that goes back to your buyer broker compensation. You can't get more unless it's agreed upon. So just make sure you completely understand that. Let's see. This addendum provides the undersigned written consent for buyer broker to receive compensation from more than one party in the transaction. Meaning, while the buyer and the buyer's agent have the buyer broker agreement, this addendum states that it's okay that the buyer compensation is being paid by the seller, not the buyer. That is what that means. Seller and buyer explicitly intend brokers to be direct third-party beneficiaries of the contract and or lease agreement pursuant to this addendum and either Section 8F or Section 9G of the contract. The provisions of the addendum shall survive. Close of escrow. You can put additional terms and conditions. I don't really know what you would put in there, but you can. And then all parties have to sign this. So buyer will sign it. You send it over to the seller. If the seller accepts it, they're going to sign this in it and send it back. Even if they counter you, they still have to sign this form and send it back with the counter offer, which would state seller compensation addendum line 10 to read 2.5%. That means that the seller is not willing to pay you 3%. They're willing to pay you 2.5%, and they're countering it because the buyer agent compensation is now part of the contract and it's negotiable. Let's see, I've lost my train of thought. So the flow of these forms, right? You've got your agency form signed by the buyer in the beginning. The next form that you sign is either dating form or the marry me form. Push for the marry me form, get the exclusive. You don't want them cheating on you. You want to protect your compensation. Explain to the buyer how the process works. Yes, you're agreeing to pay me this, but I'm going to negotiate it with the seller through the purchase contract that they will pay me so that you do not have to. If you are willing to reduce your compensation, have that conversation with them about that. Have the conversation with them if you don't want to reduce your commission, and this buyer would have to come with the difference, or you negotiate it through the contract with either seller concessions, etc. Nonetheless, all three of these forms somehow go together in some way. If the buyer is not willing to pay your commission, in full if the seller's not willing to. Does that make sense? If you are, when we should always be negotiating for the seller to pay the commission, because again, we're doing what's best for our client who is the buyer. We want to save money. We want to save them money. We want to keep the money in their pocket. So that we should always be trying to get some kind of seller compensation paid by the seller. Buyer agent compensation paid by the seller. Sorry about that. Okay, so tonight, again, we talked about the agency, dating, marry me form, seller compensation. They all kind of tied in together. I hope that you got a lot out of tonight and really how to know how to talk about these forms when you meet a new buyer, because they do really go hand in hand as far as like what each form does with the buying process. And I wanted you to have the confidence of having those date me, marry me conversations. And if you marry me, you're trusting me that I'm going to do what's best for you and in your best interest. And that's getting the buyer agent compensation negotiated with the seller through the contract. That is all I have for you tonight. Any questions? Great. Thank you so much for coming. This was recorded and it will be put on my YouTube channel. So if you ever need to go back and revisit it, please feel free. Thank you so much for coming. Have a amazing evening.